Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. In this video I'll talk and give some thoughts on the first two books in Brothers Karamazov, which takes us through the first 91 pages. And I have to say it's been an amazing start. I am completely engulfed in it. I have scribbled in messy notes all over this edition, and I feel like there really is a lot to unpack here quite already. But let's get into it. So the first thing we notice when we start reading is there's a note from the author or the narrator, so to speak, that introduces the work. And that sets the tone for a couple of things. The first thing is that there is a clear, distinct narrative voice in the novel, as is typical of Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky doesn't necessarily show, he tells, and he tells through dialogue. So you have to pay a lot of attention in the dialogues and in the monologues, because that is where all the meat is on the bone. Unlike, for instance, the pure realists like Flaubert, his narrator tells you also the characteristics and the moral character of the people, and his descriptions are laden with negative and positive words, and you should pay attention to those, because Dostoevsky is trying to set up these characters as different types or different archetypes, really, and different aspects of the human nature. So the second thing it sets up is that this whole book, which for some often is said to be one of the greatest pieces of literature ever written, this whole book in its entirety is unfinished. This was actually meant to be part one and an introduction to an equally long and dense book, part two, which was supposed to be published and supposed to take place in the present day of the 1880s when it's written, whereas this one takes place during the 1865-66. That part two never got published because Dostoevsky died. But isn't it amazing that perhaps one of the greatest pieces of literature ever written is unfinished and was actually only part one? One can only wonder what would happen if we had a part two to this. Okay, so as we get started, book one, we through the narrative voice, we get background information on the main characters in Brothers Karamazov, and their childhood and some of the family dynamics, because this is in many ways, it seems like, a family saga. So we have a couple of characters here. Most notably, we have the father, Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, and his three sons, Dmitri, Ivan, and Alyosha. They are frequently also referred to with 2-3 different nicknames as well, just to keep things interesting. But I'll try to refer to them consistently by their main name here. He introduces these characters and their different childhoods that they have had. Dmitri is the oldest son, and he is the son of Pavlovich's first wife, and Ivan and Alyosha is from his second marriage. Now, these characters, as I tried to say yesterday, Dostoevsky's characters are not completely real. He saw himself as a fantastical realist, which I think is a good description, and he really draws up characters as archetypes. So, and you can see the influence in his characters here from his earlier works. So the father is described as this archetypal evil jester sort of character. He's a liar. He is he makes a mockery of the church, of the faith. He is greedy. He is petty. He is the same type of jester that Svidrigailov is in Crime and Punishment. You have Ivan, the middle son. he is the nihilist or the rationalist. He's the same type of character as Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, perhaps, in terms of how he sees life and society. And you have Alyosha, who is the youngest son and is described in the introduction by the narrator as the hero of the story. Alyosha is also named after Dostoevsky's son, who died age 3 around the time where he wrote this novel. So there are references to that all through, also here in the beginning. Alyosha is a saint-like character, a Christ figure. There is some of Prince Myshkin from The Idiot in him for sure. He is described as, you know, meek and kind, and with a sensitivity to you know, vulgarities and more sensual pleasures. But he's also, we see later on in the part 1, he's also described as someone who is having to suppress those things in him. So he is not pure. Ivan is a rationalist, but he might not also be pure. So we can see that these 3 characters are archetypes, but they're brought a little bit down to earth by giving them more realistic features. So in reality, Dostoevsky is saying Ivan is complicated, but it's his rational thought that is mostly in control. Alyosha is human with human desires and needs, but he is mostly pure and spiritual. And Dmitri is mostly sensual and hedonistic, but they all contain all aspects of humans. And indeed, you can put all 3 of them together and you would kind of have more of a complete human being, but they are separated into these archetypes in order for Dostoevsky to examine them and to juxtapose them against each other. And yeah, so that's an important thing about Dostoevsky, about archetypes. And, you know, he draws these archetypes from what Jung would call the collective unconscious, and from, you know, certain monomyths that we have in literature and in ancient classics. And monomyths are these type of stories that we have across cultures. In every society, you have different versions of myth and legend telling about a hero's journey, a fallen woman, etc., etc. What Dostoevsky does with these characters is he draws upon archetype and monomyth, which is usually told in high, see if I can get this word right, high mimetic. Archetypes and legends are usually highly mimetic. Highly mimetic is stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and even Lord of the Rings, which is also called high fantasy. When something is highly mimetic, it is not realistic. It does not contain the sort of everyday kitchen sink realism. It doesn't contain any of the mundane happenings that everyone goes through. Indeed, in Lord of the Rings, nobody ever goes to the toilet, okay? Nobody worries about where to get money for food and things like that. So a low mimetic fantasy tale, for instance, to compare to, for instance, Lord of the Rings, is Game of Thrones. Lord of the Rings, nothing is said about how the economy of the whole thing works. How can you have the Shire with hobbits that just sit around doing fuck all day and you know, have tea in the garden? Nobody grows any crops of any significance. No one has any jobs. There's nothing that talks about how the society is being kept together as a whole. And nobody goes to the bathroom. Nobody gets a skin rash. In Game of Thrones, you see that economy and political intrigues is very much at the forefront. And you see the House Lannister is, you know, dominating Westeros, not because they are better men or stronger or faster like some ancient Greek hero. No, they dominate because they are wealthy. It's the economy that rules the situation. And another example of Game of Thrones being low mimetic is that Tyrion commits parricide and kills his father while his father is sitting on the loo, right? when you read Game of Thrones, you get a feeling that someone could get stabbed in the back while urinating behind a tree. That doesn't happen in Lord of the Rings. So Dostoevsky takes these archetypal characters and then pulls them a little bit down to earth and puts them in everyday situations of contemporary Russia. Okay, so the father, the oldest son, Dmitri, Ivan, the nihilist and intellectual, and Alyosha, the spiritual, kind son. We get in the first book most of this sort of background story with other characters put in, but I think this is sort of the gist of the first book, is that we try to set the scene. Then in the second book, we learn, we get introduced to the monastery and the elder, Susima, and we learn that our brothers and their father will be meeting at the monastery to discuss some family issue. And that whole scene at the monastery with the elder is played out in a completely comical, satirical way. We see the father lying, mocking the church, mocking the elder. The elder is sort of a spiritual person, not a priest, but one that pilgrims come to for blessings and for guidance and so on. And indeed, Dostoevsky is drawing upon the monastery and upon Father Susima, not the elder Susima, from his own experiences when he had a crisis following the son of his death. He himself got spiritual guidance from someone similar. So that is a role that was part of the Orthodox Church in Russia. So we see also that this great conflict that we have in the family has to do with two things. It has to do with money, and it has to do with a woman. We learn that Father Pavlovich Karamazov is wealthy, is rich. He's been mostly, a parasite and sponging of other people, but he's amassed a fortune. His older son, Dmitri, feels an entitlement to inherit that money, but his father does not want to give it to him. So that's one part of the conflict, all has to do with money. The second part of the conflict is a woman. We have a bit of an Oedipus situation going on here between the father and Dmitri, because Dmitri was engaged to Katerina, I think that was her name, Katerina Ivanova, which is a noble woman of good heritage, but he is falling in love with Grushenko, I think, a simple woman of questionable descent and questionable moral character. But his father, the old dirty pig, is also in love with her, or wants her at least. So you have a quarrel, a sexual conflict between the father and his son over this woman. And in the middle, in between, you have Ivan. Ivan is the one we don't see a lot of at this part of the novel. He is more reserved, he is subtle, he is observant, he is indeed an intellectual. But we get some indication through a speech made by Rakitin to Alyosha that Ivan is perhaps having some interest in Katerina Ivanova, perhaps because of her money, who is the fiancée of Dmitri. So he has a horse in the race between his father and his brother, because if Dmitri is free to pursue Grushenko, that means that Katerina could be available for him. And indeed, towards the end of book 2, after we've had the meeting at the monastery with the elder, which turns into a complete catastrophe with shouting and yelling and lying and conflict and people storming out, and they then go to the dinner with the head of the monastery, which also turns into a catastrophe. Indeed, towards the end of that, when Pavlovich, the father, and Ivan leaves and they have a conversation in the carriage, we get a sense that perhaps Ivan was and I don't know if this is true, but perhaps Ivan was actually the one who planned all of this. So that's interesting. And in book 2 as well, we have some monologues and dialogues pertaining to the nature of religion and the function of church versus state. And this is here where Dostoevsky is already, you can say, pitching in different ideas. And Ivan, we are told, has written a article where he advocates for a complete, integration between the church and the state, elevating the church to the supreme society, government function, basically. I forget what the name is in English, but he has written an article about that. But Zosima the elder sees through him. He tells him that he knows that Ivan does not believe what he has written himself, because Ivan is indeed an atheist. Another important thing that happens in that chapter is when the brothers and the father is meeting with Zosima at the monastery. At some point, there is a particular scene where the elder is bowing very deeply to Dmitri in a weird way, and there comes a commentary on it afterwards in the conversation between Rakitin and Alyosha. And if we see here, Alyosha thought for a moment that he had fallen from weakness, but it was something else. Kneeling in front of Dmitri Fyodorovich, the elder bowed down at his feet with a full, distinct, conscious bow, and even touched the floor with his forehead. Alyosha was so amazed that he failed to support him as he got to his feet. A weak smile barely glimmered on his lips. Forgive me, all of you, he said, bowing on all sides to his guests. Dmitri Fyodorovich stood dumbstruck for a few moments, bowing at his feet. What was that? Then suddenly he cried out, "Oh God," and covering his face with his hand, rushed from the room. This is clearly an important scene. We don't know exactly why, but it's completely out of character for the elder, and it seems that there is some secret meaning that Dmitri is also picking up on. Indeed, already a few times throughout the first 2 books, we have had some foreshadowing, and we get more of that afterwards in the conversation between Rakitin and Alyosha, where Rakitin tells Alyosha, he asks him if the elder has told him about why he did that bow, and Alyosha says that he hasn't. And then Rakitin spoke his mind. A crime in your nice little family. It will take place between your dear brothers and your nice rich papa. So Father Zosima bumps his forehead on the ground for the future, just in case. Afterwards they'll say, it's what the holy elder foretold, prophesied. Though bumping your forehead on the ground isn't much of a prophecy. No, they'll say, it was an emblem, an allegory, the devil knows what. They'll proclaim it, they'll remember. He foresaw the crime and marked the criminal. It's always like that with holy fools. They cross themselves before a tavern and cast stones at the temple. Your elder is the same. He drives the just man out with a stick and bows at the murderer's feet. So we get some foreshadowing here about a potential parasite, and a lot of the things we already talked about kind of indicate something in that direction as well. So that's very interesting. This became a little bit more rambly than I had anticipated, but there is really just much to unpack already now with the first 91 pages. It is a book that I don't think it's a particularly difficult book to read, in the sense that the meaning is fairly clear, but you do have to study it more than you read it. Like, you do have to pay attention to the dialogues. You do have to really slow down and deep read and think about what it is that Dostoevsky is portraying through his characters. What sort of philosophical existential ideas is it that he is putting to the paper? But yeah, I'm so far absolutely engulfed in this, and I can't wait to read more of it. Thank you.